The rusted gate of the Broken Arrow Ranch creaked in the desert wind as Jake Morrison stepped onto the property he hadn't seen in 15 years. His grandfather's funeral was yesterday, but the old man's final words still echoed in his mind. "Whatever you do, boy, don't let them near the barn." Jake had traded his Wrangler jeans for Wall Street suits long ago, running from memories of this godforsaken place. But standing here now, watching tumbleweeds dance across the cracked earth, something stirred deep in his chest, the ghost of the cowboy he used to be. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered doors padlocked with chains that looked brand new. Strange, considering Grandpa Joe had been too sick to work cattle for months. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his hip, muscle memory searching for the Colt. 45, he'd learned to draw faster than lightning as a kid. A black SUV appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as it approached. They'd found him already. What secret had his grandfather died protecting, and why were dangerous men willing to kill for it? Jake's throat went dry as the vehicle drew closer. The suit he'd worn to the funeral felt suffocating under the merciless Texas sun. He should have changed into something more practical, but he'd planned to be in and out, sign the papers, sell the ranch, and catch the red-eye back to Manhattan. Simple. Nothing about this felt simple anymore. The SUV stopped 50 yards away, and two men emerged. Even at this distance, Jake could see the bulge of shoulder holsters beneath their jackets. The taller one wore mirrored sunglasses and moved with military precision. His companion was shorter, stockier, with hands that hung loose at his sides. Ready hands. "Mr. Morrison," the tall one called out, his voice carrying easily across the still air. "We'd like a word with you." Jake stayed put, his mind racing. These weren't local law enforcement or county officials. Everything about them screamed federal, or worse, private contractors, the kind of men who made problems disappear. "Afraid you caught me at a bad time," Jake replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Just here to settle my grandfather's affairs." The shorter man whispered something to his partner, who nodded curtly. They began walking toward Jake with measured steps, their hands visible but ready to move fast. "That's exactly what we want to discuss," the tall one said. "Your grandfather's affairs. Specifically what he might have left behind." Jake's gaze flicked to the barn. Whatever was inside those walls had gotten Grandpa Joe killed. He was certain of it now. The old man hadn't died peacefully in his sleep, like the doctor claimed. The fear in those dying eyes, the desperate grip on Jake's wrist, the whispered warning. It all made sense. "Just old farming equipment and memories," Jake said, backing slowly toward the main house. "Nothing worth traveling out here for." "Mr. Morrison," the tall man's voice hardened, "we know your grandfather contacted you 3 weeks ago. We know about the package he mailed to your apartment in New York. We also know you flew down here the day after receiving it." Jake's blood chilled. There had been no package. Grandpa Joe had only called once, rambling about the past and asking Jake to visit. But these men believed otherwise, which meant they'd been watching the old man closely before he died. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Jake said, his hand brushing against the porch railing of the house. The wood felt solid, real, anchoring him to this moment. "No misunderstanding." The shorter man spoke for the first time, his accent carrying traces of Eastern Europe. "Your grandfather took something that doesn't belong to him. We want it back. What exactly are you looking for?" The men exchanged glances. The tall one reached into his jacket slowly, producing a photograph. "Your grandfather was seen removing this from a federal facility 30 years ago. We have reason to believe it's hidden on this property." Jake couldn't make out the details from this distance, but the photo appeared to show some kind of metal briefcase or container. His mind raced back to childhood summers spent exploring every inch of this ranch. He'd never seen anything unusual, but then again, Grandpa Joe had always kept certain areas off limits. The barn had been one of them. 30 years is a long time, Jake said carefully. If something was here, it could be anywhere by now. Sold, buried, destroyed. We don't think so, the tall man replied. Joseph Morrison was many things, but he wasn't wasteful. He kept what he took for a reason. The question is whether you're going to cooperate or if this needs to become difficult. The threat hung in the air like heat shimmer. Jake felt sweat trickling down his spine, and it wasn't just from the sun. His grandfather had died protecting something these men desperately wanted, and now they expected Jake to hand it over. The problem was, he had no idea what they were talking about, but he was damn sure going to find out. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at what generously passed for Millfield Station, a weathered bench beside a faded Coca-Cola sign that had seen better decades. Jake grabbed his duffel bag and stepped into the oppressive Texas heat, watching the bus disappear in a cloud of diesel exhaust down the empty highway. The town stretched before him like something preserved in amber, all sun-bleached storefronts and pickup trucks that looked older than he was. A few locals watched him from the shade of a gas station awning, their eyes tracking his movements with the unhurried curiosity of people who noticed everything new because nothing ever changed. Jake pulled out his phone to call the taxi service mentioned on a business card he'd found online, but the screen showed no signal. Of course, he was about to ask directions when a gravelly voice called out behind him. "You'd be Jake Morrison." He turned to find a man in his 60s approaching, all weathered leather and careful movements. The stranger wore a khaki uniform with a star pinned to his chest, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of steady assessment that came with decades of reading people. "Sheriff Tom Cassidy," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "Your grandfather and I went way back. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Jake shook the offered hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in the sheriff's voice. "I was actually trying to find a way out to the ranch. Figured as much. Cell service is spotty out here, and Earl's taxi quit running last spring." Cassidy gestured toward a dusty patrol car. "I was heading that direction anyway. Hop in." They drove in comfortable silence through rolling hills dotted with mesquite and live oak. The landscape felt both foreign and strangely familiar, as if something deep in Jake's DNA recognized this place despite his city upbringing. His grandfather had brought him here exactly once, when Jake was 7 years old. He remembered very little except the vastness of the sky and his mother's tight-lipped disapproval when they returned to Dallas. "Your grandfather was a good man," Cassidy said eventually. "Kept to himself mostly, but he'd help anyone who asked. This county's going to miss him." "I barely knew him," Jake admitted. "My mother and he didn't exactly see eye to eye." "Family's complicated." The sheriff's tone suggested he knew something about that particular brand of complication. "Robert mentioned you a few times over the years. Said you were making something of yourself up in the city." Was. Past tense. Jake watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. "Sometimes life has other plans." They turned onto a gravel road that seemed to stretch toward the horizon. The ranch house appeared gradually, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch that had probably been white once upon a time. Behind it stood a large red barn that looked like it had been built to last centuries, and beyond that, endless acres of grass and sky. Cassidy pulled up beside the house and killed the engine, keys under the ceramic rooster on the porch, just like always. Robert never saw much point in locks out here. Jake climbed out, shouldering his bag. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, no urban white noise, just wind through grass and the distant lowing of cattle. "Sheriff?" Jake paused beside the car. "Why were you heading this way anyway?" Cassidy's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Routine patrol. We've had some unusual activity in the area lately. Probably nothing, but it pays to keep an eye on things. What kind of activity? Strangers asking questions about your grandfather's property. Happened a few times in the weeks before he passed. Could be land developers, could be nothing at all. The sheriff started the engine. But Jake, your grandfather was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. If you find anything that seems out of place, you give me a call. The patrol car pulled away, leaving Jake alone with the wind and the weight of inherited responsibility. He found the key exactly where Cassidy had said it would be, and let himself into the house. The interior smelled of leather and old wood, masculine and lived in. Family photos lined the mantel, including several of a young Jake he barely remembered posing for. He dropped his bag in what had clearly been his grandfather's bedroom and walked back outside. The barn drew his attention like a magnet. It was larger than it had appeared from the road, with heavy wooden doors secured by a simple latch. Something about it felt significant, though he couldn't say why. As Jake approached the barn, gravel crunched behind him. He turned to see a black SUV with tinted windows slowing down on the main road. It paused for a long moment, engine idling, before accelerating away toward town. The sheriff's words echoed in his mind, strangers asking questions. Jake looked back at the barn, then at the empty road where the SUV had disappeared. Whatever secrets this place held, he had a feeling he was about to discover them whether he wanted to or not. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake made his way to the barn, coffee mug in hand, and his grandfather's journal tucked under his arm. He'd spent most of the night reading Samuel's careful entries, discovering a man far more complex than the simple rancher he'd remembered from childhood visits. The barn doors groaned on their hinges as he pulled them open, disturbing a family of sparrows that burst from the rafters in a flurry of wings. Dust motes danced in the golden light, streaming through gaps in the weathered boards. Jake stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old hay and leather that transported him back 20 years to summer afternoons spent exploring this very space. But today, he wasn't a curious 8-year-old. He was a man trying to understand why his grandfather had left him a ranch worth more than a small fortune, when they'd barely spoken in the last decade of Samuel's life. Jake set his coffee on a workbench and opened the journal to a passage that had kept him awake. The old mine shaft behind the north pasture still runs deep. Some secrets are better left buried, but a man has to live with his choices. If something happens to me, the truth is hidden where only family would think to look. He'd found no mention of any mine in the property records. Hell, he hadn't even known there was mining history on the land. But Samuel's words carried a weight that made Jake's skin crawl. A floorboard creaked behind him. Jake spun around to find a man silhouetted in the doorway, tall, lean, wearing a sheriff's star that caught the morning light. The stranger stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal silver hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Jake's face. "You'd be Samuel's grandson," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Sheriff Clayton Webb. Been meaning to stop by and pay my respects. Jake Morrison." He closed the journal casually but kept one hand on it. "Appreciate you coming by, Sheriff." Webb's gaze swept the barn interior with practiced efficiency. "Mighty fine place, this ranch. Your grandfather and I went back a long way. Hate to see it sitting empty." "Who says it's sitting empty?" A thin smile played at Webb's lips. "Word travels fast in small towns, son. Heard you were some kind of computer programmer up in Dallas. Can't imagine ranch life holds much appeal for a city boy." There was something in Webb's tone that set Jake's teeth on edge. A casual condescension that reminded him why he'd been eager to leave Texas in the first place. "I haven't decided what I'm doing yet." "Course not. Big decision like that takes time." Webb moved deeper into the barn, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Your grandfather ever tell you much about the old days? This country's got a long history, not all of it pretty. Jake watched the sheriff examine a row of rusted tools hanging on the wall. He wasn't much for storytelling. That's a shame. Samuel knew more about this area than just about anybody. The land, the people, the business arrangements that kept things running smooth. Webb turned back to Jake, those pale eyes unreadable. Sometimes knowledge like that becomes a burden. What kind of burden? The kind that makes a man careful about who he trusts. Webb's hand rested casually on his gun belt. See, there's been some talk lately. Folks wondering if Samuel might have left behind records, personal effects that could cause trouble for people who've moved on from past mistakes. Jake felt his pulse quicken. What kind of records? Oh, nothing specific, just idle speculation. Webb replaced his hat, adjusting the brim to shadow his face. But if such things existed, it might be better for everyone if they stayed buried with the past. Small towns like ours depend on folks knowing when to let sleeping dogs lie. The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, but Jake heard it clearly enough. His grandfather's journal suddenly felt like it was burning against his ribs. I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff. I'm sure you will. Webb moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, son. This country can be dangerous for folks who aren't familiar with it. Rattlesnakes, wild hogs, old mine shafts that aren't properly marked. Easy for a city boy to have an accident if he goes wandering around where he doesn't belong. Jake met his stare. I'll be careful. See that you are. Webb touched the brim of his hat. Give my regards to your folks when you head back to Dallas. The sheriff's boots crunched on gravel as he walked to his patrol car. Jake watched through the barn doors as Webb drove away, dust billowing behind the vehicle like a brown prayer flag. When the sound of the engine faded, Jake opened his grandfather's journal again. His hands were shaking slightly as he turned to the entry about the mine shaft. Whatever Samuel had hidden, people were willing to kill to keep it buried. The question was whether Jake had the courage to dig it up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake stood before the barn doors, his grandfather's journal clutched in his sweaty palm. 3 days had passed since he'd found the hidden compartment, and the cryptic entries had kept him awake each night. References to the cargo, Houston contacts, and ominous warnings about keeping the family safe painted a picture Jake wasn't sure he wanted to complete. He'd been putting off this moment, telling himself he needed to fix the fence line or check the water pump. But the truth was simpler. He was scared. Whatever his grandfather had been involved in, it was big enough to warrant coded messages and hidden spaces. The barn doors creaked as he pulled them open, disturbing a family of swallows that had nested in the rafters. Dust motes danced in the morning light as Jake made his way to the back wall where he'd discovered the compartment. This time, he came prepared with a proper flashlight and crowbar. The wooden panel gave way easier than before, revealing the dark cavity beyond. Jake aimed his beam into the space and immediately saw what he'd missed in his initial shock. The compartment was deeper than he'd realized, extending several feet into the wall. His light caught the edge of something metallic. Reaching inside, his fingers closed around a small metal box, roughly the size of a cigar case. It was heavier than expected, with an intricate lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything that belonged on a cattle ranch. Next to where the box had sat, Jake spotted a manila envelope, yellow with age. He pulled both items out and settled onto a hay bale, his heart hammering as he opened the envelope first. Inside were photographs, black and white images that made his blood run cold. The pictures showed his grandfather, at least 20 years younger, standing next to well-dressed men beside expensive cars. But it wasn't the luxury that unsettled Jake. It was the setting. The photos were taken right here, in front of this very barn. One photograph showed the trunk of a sedan filled with what looked like wrapped packages. Another captured his grandfather shaking hands with a man in a tailored suit, briefcases visible at their feet. The final image was the most disturbing. His grandfather and two other men standing guard while a group of workers carried wooden crates into the barn. Jake's hands trembled as he studied his grandfather's face in the photos. The man he remembered as a quiet rancher who taught him to ride horses and rope cattle had clearly been involved in something far more dangerous. The dates on the back of the photographs spanned 3 years in the late 1980s. A sound outside made Jake freeze. The low rumble of an engine approaching from the main road reached his ears, growing steadily louder. He quickly stuffed the photographs back into the envelope and grabbed the metal box, his mind racing. No one knew he was here. No one should be coming to the ranch. Moving to the barn's side window, Jake peered through the grimy glass and felt his stomach drop. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up the dirt road, followed by a second identical vehicle. These weren't neighbors coming to pay respects or real estate agents checking on the property. Jake's military training kicked in. He pocketed the envelope and metal box, then quickly replaced the wooden panel, scattering loose hay to hide any evidence of his discovery. The vehicles were getting closer, and he needed an escape route. The barn's rear door opened onto a pasture that stretched toward a line of oak trees. If he could reach that cover, he might be able to circle back to the house and his truck. But first, he needed to hide the evidence. Moving quickly, Jake climbed into the barn's loft and found a loose floorboard near the back wall. He wedged the envelope and metal box underneath, making a mental note of the location. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the ranch. "Mr. Morrison?" a voice called out, professional but with an edge that made Jake's skin crawl. "We'd like to have a word with you." Jake remained silent, pressed against the loft's back wall. Through a gap in the wooden slats, he could see 2 men in dark suits approaching the barn. They moved with the controlled precision of professionals, the kind of professionals who carried guns. "We know you're here, son," the same voice continued. "Closer now. Your truck's parked right out front. We just want to talk about your grandfather's property, about what he might have left behind." The barn door squeaked as it opened wider. Jake held his breath, calculating distances and angles. The rear door was 15 feet away, but he'd have to drop from the loft to reach it. The sound would give him away instantly. "Check the loft," came a second voice, this one with a slight accent Jake couldn't place. Footsteps moved across the barn floor below. Jake closed his eyes, gripped the hay fork beside him, and prepared to fight for his life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake stood in the kitchen, nursing his second cup of coffee and staring out at the barn. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by dreams of his grandfather's voice echoing through empty corridors and the persistent feeling that eyes were watching him from the darkness beyond his windows. His phone buzzed against the wooden table. The caller ID showed a local number he didn't recognize. "Jake Morrison? This is Sheriff Elena Vasquez, Brewster County. I understand you're Samuel Morrison's grandson." Jake's grip tightened on the phone. "That's right. Is there a problem?" "I'm afraid there might be. We found your grandfather's truck abandoned about 20 miles south of your property, down by the Rio Grande. Been there a while by the looks of it. I was hoping we could talk." The coffee turned bitter in his mouth. "Abandoned? But the report said he died in his sleep, natural causes. That's what the paperwork says. Mind if I come by this morning? There are some things that don't quite add up." An hour later, Sheriff Vasquez's patrol vehicle kicked up a cloud of dust as it approached the house. Jake watched from the porch as a woman in her 40s climbed out, her movements economical and purposeful. She wore the standard khaki uniform, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she'd seen more than her share of trouble in this remote corner of Texas. "Mr. Morrison," she extended a calloused hand. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. Call me Jake. You said there were things that didn't add up?" Vasquez nodded, her dark eyes scanning the property with professional interest. "Your grandfather was found in his bed by Doc Martinez when he came for a routine visit. Death certificate lists heart failure. But Samuel's truck was discovered 3 days later, keys still in the ignition, parked near some old smuggling trails. Smuggling trails? This area's got a long history with the border trade, both legal and otherwise. Thing is, your grandfather hadn't driven in months according to the neighbors. Bad eyesight, shaky hands. So what was his truck doing 20 miles from here? Jake felt the ground shifting beneath him again, the way it had when he'd first arrived and realized how little he knew about his grandfather's life. Maybe someone borrowed it. Maybe. Vasquez didn't sound convinced. Mind if I look around? Sometimes being on the property helps me understand what might have happened. They walked the grounds together, Vasquez asking casual questions about Jake's plans for the ranch, his grandfather's habits, any visitors he might have mentioned. Her tone was conversational, but Jake sensed she was cataloging every detail. When they reached the barn, she paused. This the original structure? I think so. Haven't really explored it much yet. The lie came easier than he'd expected, but something told him to keep the hidden room to himself until he understood what he'd stumbled into. Vasquez tried the door, finding it locked. Your grandfather kept this secured? Apparently. I haven't found the key yet. She nodded, making a note. Samuel was always particular about his privacy. Probably just old farming equipment anyway. But her eyes lingered on the weathered wood, and Jake got the impression she was filing away every detail. As they walked back toward her vehicle, Vasquez stopped and fixed him with a direct stare. Jake, I'm going to give you some advice. This is beautiful country, but it's also dangerous if you don't know what you're dealing with. There are people who use these remote areas for activities they'd rather keep private. Your grandfather understood that. He kept to himself, minded his own business. Are you saying he was involved in something illegal? I'm saying he was smart enough to stay out of other people's business. You'd be wise to do the same. She opened her car door, then paused. One more thing, if you find anything unusual while you're settling his affairs, anything that doesn't seem to belong, you call me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. After she drove away, Jake stood in the settling dust, her words echoing in his mind. The warning had been clear enough, but it only made him more determined to understand what his grandfather had been protecting. He retrieved the key from the house and headed back to the barn. The hidden room was exactly as he'd left it, but in the daylight filtering through the cracks in the walls, he could see details he'd missed before. The maps weren't just of local terrain. They showed routes that crossed the Mexican border, with dates and notations in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Some of the dates were recent, very recent. Jake studied the photographs again, recognizing now that the men in expensive suits weren't local ranchers. They had the look of people accustomed to power, to having their orders followed without question. His grandfather hadn't been the simple hermit Jake had imagined. Samuel Morrison had been watching, documenting, preparing for something, and now Jake was standing in the middle of it, holding secrets that someone had already killed for. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake stood in the kitchen, nursing his third cup of coffee and staring at the barn through the window. Sleep had been elusive after yesterday's discoveries, his mind churning over the implications of what he'd found. The ledger sat on the kitchen table like a loaded gun, its pages filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts that painted a picture he was only beginning to understand. His grandfather's handwriting documented transactions spanning decades, payments made, services rendered, and what appeared to be protection money changing hands. The most recent entries were dated just weeks before the old man's death, suggesting whatever operation this was, it hadn't died with him. Jake had spent hours trying to make sense of the cryptic notations. Some entries were straightforward enough. Payment received, MC $50,000 or shipment delayed, weather. But others were more troubling. Problem with local, handled, and sheriff asking questions, dealt with. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway snapped him from his thoughts. Through the window, he watched a black SUV approach, identical to the one from yesterday. His pulse quickened as two men stepped out, the same pair who'd claimed to be interested in buying the ranch. Jake grabbed the ledger and quickly stuffed it into the kitchen junk drawer, his hands steadier than he expected. He'd grown up soft in the city, but something about this place, about the threat hanging over it, was awakening instincts he didn't know he possessed. The knock came firm and authoritative. Jake opened the door to find the older man's smile notably absent this time. "Mr. Morrison, mind if we come in? We need to talk." "Actually, I do mind," Jake replied, stepping onto the porch and pulling the door closed behind him. "Whatever you want to discuss, we can do it out here." The younger man shifted slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of shoulder holster beneath his jacket. These weren't real estate investors, and they weren't bothering to pretend anymore. "Your grandfather was a reasonable man," the older one continued. "He understood the value of cooperation. We're hoping you inherited more than just his land. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." The man's tone carried a hint of patronizing menace. "But you're going to learn. See, your grandfather provided certain services for our organization. Storage, primarily. Temporary housing for inventory as it moved through the region." Jake's mind raced back to the barn, to the hidden compartment and the ledger's cryptic entries. The pieces were clicking into place with terrifying clarity. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Jake said. "I'm just here to settle the estate and sell the place." "That's where you're wrong." The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a distinct accent Jake couldn't place. "This ranch has been part of our supply chain for 15 years. Your grandfather's death doesn't change that arrangement. And if I'm not interested in continuing the family business?" The two men exchanged glances. "Everyone's interested in staying alive, Mr. Morrison. Your grandfather understood that. Question is, are you as smart as he was?" Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I need time to think about this." "Time's a luxury we don't have," the older man replied. "We've got a shipment coming through next week. The barn needs to be ready, just like always." "What kind of shipment?" "The kind that pays well enough to keep this ranch profitable. Your grandfather never asked too many questions, and neither should you." Jake's jaw tightened. Whatever his grandfather had gotten involved with, it was clearly something that went far beyond simple cattle ranching. The ledger's entries, the hidden compartment, the threatening visit, it all pointed to an operation that had turned his inheritance into a liability. "I'll need a few days," Jake said finally. "You've got 48 hours to make the barn ready. After that, we stop being polite." The older man stepped closer, close enough that Jake could smell his cologne and see the cold calculation in his eyes. "And Mr. Morrison? Don't even think about involving the authorities. Your grandfather learned early on that the local law enforcement understands the value of selective blindness." The two men walked back to their SUV without another word, leaving Jake standing alone on the porch. He watched them drive away, his mind already working through his limited options. He could run, abandon the ranch, and disappear back into city anonymity. He could cooperate, become another link in whatever chain his grandfather had forged. Or he could fight. As the dust settled from their departure, Jake looked out across the land his family had worked for generations. His grandfather might have made compromises to keep it, but Jake was beginning to realize he'd inherited more than just property. He'd inherited a war. And 48 hours wasn't much time to choose which side he'd fight on. The first shot shattered the kitchen window as Jake dove behind the heavy oak table his grandfather had built decades ago. Glass sprayed across the linoleum floor like deadly confetti, and the bitter taste of fear flooded his mouth. He clutched the .45 Colt he'd found in his grandfather's desk, his city-soft hands trembling against the worn grip. "We know you're in there, boy," The voice carried across the yard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Just want to have a conversation about what you found in that barn." Jake's mind raced. 3 vehicles had pulled up his drive just after sunset, black SUVs with tinted windows that screamed federal government or worse. But these men weren't showing badges or announcing themselves as law enforcement. They'd simply started shooting. Another bullet punched through the kitchen wall, sending splinters of wood flying. Jake crawled toward the back door, staying low. The house suddenly felt enormous and exposed, every shadow a potential hiding spot for an enemy. Outside, he could hear boots crunching on gravel, spreading out to surround the building. The barn. He needed to get to the barn and destroy what was hidden there before they could claim it. Whatever those documents and photographs revealed, people were willing to commit murder to keep them buried. His grandfather had died protecting this secret. And now Jake understood why. He reached the back door and slowly turned the handle. The hinges gave a soft groan that sounded deafening in the tense silence. Through the crack, he could see the barn's dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, maybe 60 yards away across open ground. It might as well have been 60 miles. "Check the back!" someone shouted. Jake's window of opportunity slammed shut. Heavy footsteps pounded around the corner of the house. He pressed himself against the wall beside the door, raising the Colt with both hands the way he'd seen in movies, praying muscle memory from childhood BB gun practice would somehow translate to a real firefight. The door exploded inward, and a figure in tactical gear filled the frame. Jake squeezed the trigger. The .45 bucked in his hands like an angry horse, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding him. The intruder grunted and stumbled backward, crashing into the porch railing. "Man down! He's armed!" The shout galvanized the others into action. Jake didn't wait to see if his shot had been fatal. He burst through the doorway, vaulting over the wounded man, and sprinted toward the barn. Behind him, the house erupted in gunfire as multiple weapons opened up, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like deadly fireworks. Bullets whined past his ears, kicking up dirt geysers around his feet. His lungs burned as he pumped his legs harder than he had since high school track. The barn loomed larger with each desperate stride, but 60 yards felt like running through molasses under fire. A searing pain lanced across his shoulder as a bullet found its mark, spinning him sideways. He stumbled but kept his feet, warm blood soaking through his shirt. Almost there. The barn door stood slightly ajar, just as he'd left it hours earlier when his world was still normal. He dove through the opening as automatic weapons fire chewed up the wooden frame behind him. Splinters showered down as he rolled behind a hay bale, gasping. The familiar smell of dust and old leather filled his nostrils, somehow comforting despite the circumstances. His shoulder throbbed, but the wound felt superficial, a graze rather than a through and through. Lucky. In the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, he could see the loose floorboard where his grandfather's secrets lay hidden. But approaching it meant crossing 10 feet of open space under a kerosene lantern that would make him an easy target if they followed him inside. "Surround the barn," the commanding voice again, closer now. "He's trapped." Jake counted at least 4 distinct voices outside, maybe more. Professional killers with military-grade weapons against one accountant with a 6-shooter and no training. The smart play was surrender, but the blood on his shirt and the ruthless efficiency of their attack told him these men weren't taking prisoners. The barn's old wood creaked as someone tested the main door. They'd be inside within seconds. Jake made his choice, sprinting for the loose board in a low crouch. He pried it up with desperate fingers, grabbing the manila envelope and steel box underneath. Whatever was in here had cost his grandfather's life, and now threatened his own. As boots thundered across the threshold behind him, Jake tucked the envelope inside his jacket and clutched the box against his chest. A ladder led to the hayloft, and hopefully another way out. He climbed with one hand, the other still gripping the Colt, as shouts erupted below. There, in the loft, Gunfire erupted again, bullets punching through the wooden rungs inches from his face. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake emerged from the house, his grandfather's Colt, 45, heavy on his hip. 3 days had passed since his midnight encounter with the intruders, and the silence felt more ominous than comforting. He'd spent those days learning to shoot, guided by muscle memory that seemed to flow from his bloodline rather than experience. The horses nickered softly as he approached the corral. Sunset. The paint mare his grandfather had favored stepped forward with an intelligence in her dark eyes that reminded Jake of the old man himself. He'd been avoiding the barn since that night, but he knew he couldn't put off returning forever. "What do you think, girl?" he murmured, stroking her neck. "Ready to help me figure out what Grandpa got himself into?" The sound of an approaching vehicle made him freeze. A black SUV with tinted windows rolled up the dirt road, moving slowly, deliberately. Jake's hand instinctively dropped to his gun as 2 men in expensive suits climbed out. They looked as out of place on the ranch as Jake had felt just a week ago. "Mr. Caldwell?" The taller man approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Chen. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your grandfather." Jake studied their badges, noting how Morrison kept his jacket unbuttoned, easy access to his shoulder holster. "What kind of questions?" "We have reason to believe Thomas Caldwell was involved in activities that compromised national security," Chen said, her voice crisp and professional. "We need to search the property. You got a warrant?" Morrison's smile tightened. "We were hoping for your cooperation. Your grandfather was trafficking sensitive materials across the border. We have evidence linking him to several international incidents." Jake felt anger flare in his chest. Whatever his grandfather had been involved in, the man who'd taught him to ride and fish wasn't a traitor. "That's bullshit." "Is it?" Chen pulled out a tablet, showing him photographs of his grandfather meeting with men Jake didn't recognize. These were taken 6 months ago in Juarez. The man he's speaking with is a known arms dealer. The images hit Jake like a physical blow, but something about the agent's eagerness bothered him. Real FBI wouldn't have driven out here without backup, without proper procedure. They wanted something specific, and they wanted it fast. "I'll need to see that warrant," Jake said firmly. Morrison and Chen exchanged glances. "Mr. Caldwell, we're trying to protect you. There are dangerous people looking for what your grandfather hid. If you cooperate with us now—" "Get off my land!" The pleasant facade dropped from Morrison's face. "You're making a mistake, son. A big one, maybe. But it's my mistake to make." After they left, Jake stood in the yard for a long time, watching their dust trail disappear. The photographs troubled him, but not for the reasons the fake agents intended. His grandfather looked wrong in those pictures, his posture, his expression. The old man Jake remembered stood straight as a fence post, but the figure in the photos was slightly hunched, diminished. He saddled Sunset and rode toward the back pasture, following a trail he discovered yesterday while exploring the property boundaries. The path wound through mesquite and live oak, eventually leading to an old line shack his grandfather had used during roundups. But as Jake approached, he noticed something odd about the weathered building. Fresh tire tracks circled the structure. Dismounting, he approached carefully, gun drawn. The door hung open, revealing an interior that had been thoroughly searched. Furniture overturned, floorboards pried up, walls torn open. Someone had been very busy and very desperate. Inside, among the debris, Jake found something the searchers had missed. Wedged behind a loose stone in the fireplace was a small key, old brass worn smooth by handling, no bigger than his thumb, but it felt significant in his palm. A sound outside made him freeze, hoofbeats approaching fast. Jake moved to the window and saw 3 riders heading his way, their faces hidden beneath hat brims. These weren't federal agents or local law. These men sat their horses like they'd been born in the saddle, and they moved with the fluid coordination of a pack. Jake slipped out the back of the line shack and circled wide through the brush to where Sunset waited. As he swung into the saddle, he heard voices from inside the building, harsh and urgent. They were speaking Spanish, but one phrase came through clearly: La caja fuerte, the safe. He urged Sunset into a quiet walk, using the terrain to mask their movement. Whatever his grandfather had hidden, it was valuable enough to bring wolves from multiple packs to his door. The key burned in his pocket like a coal, a puzzle piece that might unlock the truth, if he lived long enough to use it. The ranch house came into view as the sun reached its zenith, but Jake no longer felt like he was coming home. He was entering a battlefield where the rules were written in blood, and his grandfather's legacy was the prize everyone was willing to kill for. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake emerged from the house, his grandfather's old Winchester cradled in his arms. The weight of it felt different now. Not just metal and wood, but legacy and responsibility. He'd spent the night cleaning and oiling the rifle, muscle memory returning despite years of city living. Sarah's truck pulled up the gravel drive, dust swirling in its wake. She stepped out, wearing jeans and boots, her badge glinting in the early light. The easy smile she usually wore was replaced by grim determination. "Any word from your friend at the FBI?" Jake asked as she approached. "Marcus is driving down from Dallas. Should be here by noon." She studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "You look like hell." "Slept about as well as you'd expect." Jake gestured toward the barn. "Been thinking about what else might be hidden on this property. If Dutch was using that tunnel system, there could be more we haven't found." They walked toward the barn together, the morning air still cool but promising another scorching day. Jake had already moved the cattle to the far pasture. No sense having them nearby if trouble came calling. "I've been thinking too," Sarah said, "about the timing of your grandfather's death. The coroner ruled it natural causes, but now we know someone wanted him out of the way." Jake's jaw tightened. "The question is whether they got tired of waiting for him to die naturally." Inside the barn, they descended into the hidden chamber. Jake had rigged a battery-powered lantern system, casting harsh light across the concrete walls. The money was gone. Jake had moved it to a safety deposit box in town before dawn, but the ledgers remained spread across the makeshift table. Sarah flipped through pages of coded entries, her finger tracing columns of numbers and abbreviated names. "Some of these dates go back 15 years. This wasn't just Dutch's operation. It was bigger than that. Look at this." Jake pointed to a series of entries from 3 months ago, right around the time his grandfather died. The numbers spiked dramatically. Whatever they were moving through here, the volume increased significantly. A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the barn floor. Jake motioned for silence, drawing his sidearm while Sarah did the same. They'd left the barn door open. Anyone could have walked in. The footsteps stopped directly over the hidden entrance. Jake's heart hammered as he imagined someone discovering the concealed hatch, trapping them below ground. But then the steps moved away, heading toward the barn's rear entrance. Jake climbed the ladder first, peering through the slightly open hatch. The barn appeared empty, shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the siding. He pushed the hatch open wider, scanning for movement. "See anything?" Sarah whispered from below. Before Jake could answer, a voice called out from near the house. "Jake Morrison! I know you're out there!" They climbed out quickly, closing the hatch behind them. Through the barn door, Jake could see a figure standing in the yard, a tall man in an expensive suit that looked out of place against the rural backdrop. Even at a distance, Jake recognized him from the photograph in Dutch's files. "That's Marcus Webb," Sarah confirmed, reading Jake's expression. "FBI." They emerged from the barn with hands visible, a precaution that proved wise when Jake spotted the tactical team positioned around his property. 4 agents in Kevlar vests, weapons ready but not aimed. Webb approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. His hair was prematurely grey, his face weathered despite the quality suit. When he spoke, his voice carried authority. "Mr. Morrison, Agent Webb, FBI. We need to talk." "I figured as much." Jake kept his rifle lowered but ready. "Though I'm wondering why you brought enough firepower to take down a small army. Because we're dealing with people who've already killed to protect their interests." Webb's gaze moved to Sarah. "Deputy Martinez, I understand you've been conducting your own investigation." "Someone had to," Sarah replied coolly, "since the FBI seemed to be looking the other way." Webb's expression didn't change, but Jake caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "What makes you think we've been looking the other way? 3 bodies in 2 days, and you show up like you already know what we found." Jake stepped forward. "Either you've got the best intelligence network in Texas, or you've been watching this place longer than you're letting on." The FBI agent studied Jake with new interest. "Your grandfather was a good man caught in a bad situation. He was trying to make things right before he died." "What kind of things?" Webb glanced at his team, then back to Jake. "The kind that could get a lot of people killed if we don't handle this carefully. Including you." The pre-dawn darkness felt different now, charged with an electricity that made Jake's skin crawl. He'd been awake for hours, watching the shadows beyond the ranch house windows, waiting for movement that never came. The silence was worse than gunfire. It meant they were planning something. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Any sign of them?" "Nothing." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his fingers around the warm ceramic. "That's what worries me." Through the window, the barn loomed like a monument to secrets in the pale starlight. Somewhere inside that structure lay evidence of a conspiracy that reached from the dusty corners of Presidio County all the way to Washington, D.C. Jake still couldn't wrap his mind around it. His grandfather, the simple rancher who taught him to rope cattle and mend fences, had somehow stumbled onto something big enough to get him killed. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside him. "They'll come back with more men, better weapons." Jake nodded, though leaving felt like abandoning everything his grandfather had died protecting. "Where would we go? Sheriff Martinez made it clear we can't trust local law enforcement. Hell, we don't know how deep this goes." The radio crackled to life on the kitchen counter, making them both jump. Jake had left it tuned to the emergency frequency all night, hoping to catch some indication of movement in the area. "Unit 7 to base. Roadblock established on County Road 47. No activity." "Copy that, 7. Unit 3. What's your status on the back roads?" "All quiet, base. Nothing moving out here but jackrabbits." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. Roadblocks. They were being boxed in, cut off from any escape route. Jake set down his coffee and moved to the gun cabinet his grandfather had kept in the corner. Inside, alongside the hunting rifles, he found something unexpected, a small digital recorder wrapped in plastic. "Sarah, look at this." He held up the device, noting his grandfather's shaky handwriting on a piece of tape. "For Jake, if something happens to me." With trembling fingers, Jake pressed play. His grandfather's voice filled the room, weaker than he remembered but unmistakably determined. "Jake, if you're hearing this, then I reckon my past finally caught up with me. What you found in the barn, those documents, that evidence, it's bigger than you know. Back in '89, I was working a case for the DEA. Officially, I was just a consultant, helping track smuggling routes through the ranch lands. Unofficially, I discovered that some of the biggest ranchers in 3 counties were in bed with the cartels." Jake's blood ran cold. His grandfather, a federal agent? It seemed impossible, yet it explains so much. The recording continued. I thought I'd buried it all when I retired, but Senator Hawthorne, he was just a state representative then. He's been trying to clean up loose ends. The papers in the barn detail payoffs, murder, drug routes that are still active today. People in very high places want that information to disappear forever. A distant rumble made Jake pause the recording. Through the window, he could see headlights approaching on the main road. Not one vehicle, but several. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip tight with fear. We need to go. Now. Jake pocketed the recorder and grabbed 2 rifles from the cabinet. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles north. Grandfather showed it to me when I was a kid. We can hide there until we figure out our next move. They slipped out the back door into the cool morning air. The approaching vehicles were closer now, their engines growing louder by the second. Jake led Sarah toward the tree line, grateful for the darkness that concealed their movement. Behind them, the ranch house erupted in light as powerful searchlights swept across the property. Voices barked orders, dogs began barking, and Jake realized with a sinking heart that this wasn't just some local cover-up anymore. This was a military-style operation. They reached the shelter of the trees just as the first vehicle pulled into the yard. Through the branches, Jake could see men in tactical gear deploying with practiced efficiency. These weren't local thugs or corrupt deputies. These were professionals. Jesus, Sarah whispered. How many people are involved in this? Jake thought about the recording, about Senator Hawthorne, about the reach of power that seemed to extend far beyond their small corner of Texas. His grandfather had stumbled onto something that threatened people with the resources to mobilize private armies. As they moved deeper into the darkness, picking their way carefully through the brush, Jake felt the weight of his heritage settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just some city boy playing at being a cowboy anymore. He was the keeper of secrets that men would kill for, the inheritor of a legacy written in blood and buried in shadows. The mine shaft lay ahead, offering temporary sanctuary. But Jake knew their real journey was just beginning. The headlights cut through the darkness as Jake drove the pickup toward town, Elena beside him clutching the metal briefcase they'd found buried beneath the barn's floorboards. The documents inside had confirmed their worst fears. His grandfather hadn't just stumbled onto something dangerous. He'd been murdered for it. We can't go to Sheriff Morrison, Elena said, her voice tight with tension. Half these papers have his signature on them. Jake's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The evidence painted a clear picture. A conspiracy involving county officials, federal agents, and the consortium stretching back decades. His grandfather had been documenting it all, photographing meetings, copying documents, building a case that would have brought down some very powerful people. There's a state police barracks in Austin, Jake said. We get these documents to someone clean, someone outside their reach. A pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, maintaining the same distance as he slowed and accelerated. Jake's stomach knotted. They'd been careful leaving the ranch, taking back roads, but somehow they'd been found. We've got company, he muttered. Elena twisted to look back. How did they? The rear window exploded in a shower of glass as the pursuing vehicle opened fire. Jake yanked the wheel hard right, the pickup skidding onto a dirt side road that wound into the hill country. The headlights followed, gaining ground. Jake's mind raced through the terrain ahead. He'd ridden these hills as a boy with his grandfather, knew every creek bed and cattle trail. If he could reach the old mining road that cut through Devil's Canyon, the narrow passage would force their pursuers to follow single file. Another shot rang out, sparking off the tailgate. Elena had pressed herself low in the seat, the briefcase clutched against her chest like armor. There's a turnoff about half a mile ahead, Jake shouted over the engine noise. When I say jump, you bail out and run for the tree line. Get those documents to Austin, no matter what happens to me. Like hell I'm leaving you. This isn't a debate, Jake's voice carried the same iron authority his grandfather had possessed. "Those papers are the only thing that'll stop this. Without them, everyone dies. You, me, Maria, all of it for nothing." The turnoff appeared in the headlights, a narrow dirt track barely wide enough for the pickup. Jake downshifted and cranked the wheel, feeling the rear end slide out as they fishtailed onto the trail. The pursuing vehicle overshot the turn, brake lights flaring as it backed up. They'd bought maybe 30 seconds. The mining road pitched downward into the canyon, loose rocks pinging off the undercarriage. Jake killed the headlights, driving by moonlight and memory, hoping the darkness would mask their exact position. Behind them, their pursuers had found the trail, twin beams sweeping back and forth as they searched. "There," Jake pointed to a gap in the trees ahead. "That's where you run. Follow the creek bed north until you hit the highway, then flag down the first car you see." "Jake, please." He hit the brakes and reached across to open her door. "Go. Now." Elena hesitated for a heartbeat, then leaned over and kissed him hard. "Don't you dare die on me, cowboy." She grabbed the briefcase and disappeared into the darkness. Jake gunned the engine and kept driving deeper into the canyon. The pursuing headlights were closer now, maybe 100 yards back. He could see the narrow bridge ahead, a rickety wooden span his grandfather had built to cross the deepest part of the creek. It would hold the pickup, but anything heavier. He reached the bridge and floored it, the old planks groaning under the truck's weight. On the far side, he spun the wheel and slammed on the brakes, using the pickup to block the bridge's exit. Then he grabbed his grandfather's Winchester from the gun rack and took cover behind the truck bed. The first pursuit vehicle reached the bridge, a heavy SUV that made the wooden structure sag ominously. Jake aimed carefully and put 3 rounds into the front support beam. The beam splintered and the bridge tilted sharply to one side. The SUV's driver panicked, gunning the engine instead of backing off. The bridge collapsed with a thunderous crash, taking the SUV with it into the rocky creek bed 20 feet below. Steam rose from the wreckage, but Jake could see movement inside. They weren't dead, just delayed. A second vehicle appeared on the far side of the collapsed bridge. Car doors slammed and muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as gunfire erupted. Jake kept low, working his way up the canyon wall, using boulders and scrub brush for cover. He needed to buy Elena more time, keep their attention focused on him instead of searching for her. A voice echoed across the canyon, cold, professional, utterly without mercy. "Give up the documents, Inherit, and we'll make this quick. Keep running and we'll take our time with the girl." Jake levered another round into the Winchester's chamber and smiled grimly in the darkness. They'd picked the wrong cowboy to threaten. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake loaded his grandfather's old Winchester, his hands steadier than they'd been in days. The phone call from Sheriff Martinez an hour earlier had changed everything. 3 more bodies found buried near the old mining claim, all bearing the same execution-style wounds as the man in his barn. The net was tightening, and Jake could feel eyes watching him from every ridge and hollow. Sarah emerged from the house, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her face drawn with worry. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, handing him a cup. "Martinez said he'd have deputies here within the hour." Jake shook his head, scanning the tree line beyond the pasture. "By then it'll be too late. They're coming today. I can feel it. Same way Granddad always knew when a storm was brewing." He took a sip of the bitter coffee, tasting dust and determination. "Besides, this is family business now." The barn loomed behind them, its secrets finally exposed, but its dangers far from over. Inside, beneath the loose floorboards, they'd found not just the evidence of his grandfather's involvement with the smuggling operation, but something far more damaging. Detailed records of payments, names, and locations that implicated half the county's power structure. No wonder they wanted him dead. A glint of sunlight off metal caught his eye from the eastern ridge. Jake set down his coffee and raised a pair of binoculars, focusing on the distant slope. Two figures crouched behind a cluster of mesquite, and the unmistakable shape of a rifle scope protruded from their position. "Sarah, get inside. Now." She followed his gaze and cursed under her breath. "How many?" "Two that I can see. Probably more coming from other directions." Jake's mind raced through his grandfather's old stories, tales of Apache raids and cattle rustlers that had seemed like folklore just weeks ago. Now they felt like survival manuals. "Remember what I told you about the root cellar?" Sarah nodded, her reporter's instincts warring with basic human fear. "What about you?" "I'm going to give them what they came for." Jake checked the Winchester's action one more time, the metal cold and familiar in his hands. Just not the way they expect. As Sarah disappeared into the house, Jake made his way to the barn, keeping low and using the morning shadows for cover. The wooden structure that had harbored so many secrets would serve one final purpose. He'd spent the last 2 days preparing, following half-remembered instructions from his grandfather's journals, setting up what the old man had called the final insurance policy. The crack of a rifle shot split the morning air, splintering wood near his head. Jake dove behind a water trough as more shots followed, the sound echoing off the hills like thunder. 3 different positions now. They had him surrounded, just as he'd expected. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were hunting a city boy playing at being a cowboy. They didn't know about the months he'd spent here as a child, learning every gully and game trail on the property. They didn't know about the network of old mine shafts and forgotten cattle paths that honeycombed the ranch. Most importantly, they didn't know about his grandfather's final lesson, the one hidden in the barn's very foundation. Jake belly-crawled toward the barn's rear entrance, using an old irrigation ditch for cover. Bullets whined overhead, but their aim was rushed, desperate. They wanted him alive if possible. Dead would complicate their problems with the evidence he'd already shared with Martinez and the FBI. Inside the barn, he found the detonator exactly where his grandfather's journal said it would be, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden inside a fake support beam. The old man had been planning for this day for decades, preparing for the moment when his past would finally catch up with the ranch. Through a gap in the barn siding, Jake could see figures moving closer. 3 men with military-style weapons and the confidence of professionals. But confidence could be a weakness too, especially when it blinded you to the heritage of the land you were walking on. He pressed the detonator's button. The explosion wasn't large, his grandfather had been too careful for that, but it was perfectly placed. The eastern slope, already weakened by decades of erosion and old mine workings, gave way in a cascade of rock and earth. 2 of the gunmen disappeared in the landslide, their shouts lost in the rumble of shifting stone. The 3rd man, the one approaching from the south, broke cover and ran toward the barn, his rifle raised. But Jake was already moving, slipping out the back and circling around through the maze of rusted farm equipment and hay bales that suddenly felt like home territory. When Sheriff Martinez and his deputies finally arrived, they found Jake standing over an unconscious gunman, the Winchester cradled in his arms like it belonged there. The city boy was gone, replaced by something older and harder, something that belonged to this harsh and unforgiving land. The desert wind howled across the ranch as Jake crouched behind the water trough, his grandfather's rifle heavy in his hands. The spotlights from the approaching vehicles cut through the darkness like accusatory fingers, searching for him among the scattered outbuildings. He'd counted at least 6 trucks making their way up the dirt road, their engines growling promises of violence. Sarah's breathing was ragged beside him, her face pale in the moonlight. "How many rounds do you have left?" she whispered. Jake checked the rifle's magazine. 12. Maybe 13 if there's one in the chamber. Not nearly enough if those trucks were full of Blackwood's men. He thought of his grandfather's journal, now safely hidden in the storm cellar beneath the house. The old man had written about nights like this, when the desert became a battlefield and survival meant embracing the harsh lessons of the land. The lead truck's spotlight swept past their position, and Jake caught a glimpse of movement in the barn's shadow. Deputy Martinez emerged from behind a hay bale, his service weapon drawn. Jake had been right to trust him. The deputy had arrived just as the convoy appeared on the horizon, claiming he'd been tracking Blackwood's operation for months. "There," Sarah pointed toward the eastern ridge. "Someone's moving up there." Jake squinted through the darkness and spotted the silhouette of a figure picking their way along the rocky outcrop that overlooked the ranch house. A sniper, most likely, getting into position to cover the main assault. His grandfather had taught him that high ground was everything in a fight, and whoever controlled the ridge would control the battle. The trucks had stopped about 200 yards from the house, their engines idling like mechanical predators. Jake could hear voices carrying on the wind, but couldn't make out the words. They were planning their approach, probably trying to decide whether to take him alive or simply eliminate the problem he'd become. "I have to get to that ridge," Jake told Sarah. "If they get a shooter up there, we're trapped. You can't leave me here alone." Jake looked into her eyes, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. 3 days ago, she'd been investigating a simple case of corporate malfeasance. Now she was crouched in the dirt, waiting for armed men to try to kill them both. "You won't be alone. Martinez is in the barn, and he has a clear line of sight to the house. Stay low, stay hidden, and if things go bad, there's a tunnel that leads from the storm cellar to the old mine shaft. My grandfather built it during the worst of his troubles with the oil companies." Sarah nodded, though her hand trembled as she gripped the pistol Jake had given her earlier. "What about the evidence? If something happens to us..." "It won't." Jake's voice carried more confidence than he felt. "But if it does, Martinez knows where everything is hidden. He'll make sure the truth comes out." A shout echoed across the desert, followed by the slam of truck doors. They were moving. Jake kissed Sarah's forehead, then slipped away into the darkness, using the scattered equipment and storage sheds as cover. The ranch looked different at night, transformed from the peaceful homestead he'd been learning to love into something that resembled a war zone. He moved carefully, remembering his grandfather's lessons about reading the land. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound might be the last thing he heard. The rocky path up to the ridge was treacherous in daylight. In darkness, it would be like climbing through a minefield of loose stone and hidden crevices. Behind him, he heard the distinctive crack of Martinez's rifle, followed by a shout of pain and anger. The deputy had drawn first blood, which meant the real fighting was about to begin. Jake forced himself to keep climbing, even as every instinct screamed at him to turn back and help defend the house. The figure on the ridge was closer now, maybe 50 yards above Jake's position. He could see the long barrel of a rifle silhouetted against the stars and caught a glimpse of the shooter's face in profile. It was Reynolds, Blackwood's security chief, the man who'd been hunting Jake since this whole nightmare began. Jake found a stable position behind a boulder and raised his grandfather's rifle. The weapon felt solid and familiar in his hands now, no longer the foreign object it had been when he'd first arrived at the ranch. He'd learned to shoot as a boy during summer visits, but those lessons had taken on deadly importance in the past few days. Reynolds was settling into his shooting position, adjusting his scope to target the house below. In seconds, he'd have a clear shot at Sarah or Martinez. Jake took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the desert like thunder, and Reynolds pitched forward, his weapon clattering down the rocky slope. But Jake's relief was short-lived as muzzle flashes erupted from the trucks below and bullets began chewing up the rocks around his position. The pre-dawn darkness felt different now, thick with anticipation and the metallic taste of coming violence. Jake crouched behind the water trough, his grandfather's Winchester steady in his hands, watching the access road through the scope he'd mounted earlier. Maria lay flat on the barn roof, her sniper rifle trained on the main approach. Sheriff Daniels had positioned himself in the old storm cellar, covering their six. The plan was simple. Let them come, funnel them into the kill zone, and end this once and for all. But Jake knew from bitter experience that simple plans rarely survived first contact with reality. His earpiece crackled. "Movement on the ridge," Maria whispered. "4 vehicles, maybe 5. They're stopping about a mile out." Jake's pulse quickened. Cartwright was being careful, probably sending scouts first. The man hadn't survived this long in his shadow empire by being reckless. A coyote called from somewhere beyond the fence line, but Jake's trained ear caught the artificial note. He keyed his mic. "They're already here." That wasn't a coyote. The compound fell silent except for the wind moving through the mesquite. Jake counted his breathing, remembering his grandfather's lessons about patience. "A good hunter knows when to move and when to be stone," the old man used to say. Minutes stretched like hours. Then Jake caught movement near the generator shed, a shadow that moved wrong against the starlight. He tracked it through his scope, finger resting lightly on the trigger. The figure was dressed in tactical gear, moving with military precision. More shadows emerged from the darkness. Professional operators, just as Jake had expected. These weren't the crude enforcers from the bar or even the team that had hit the motel. Cartwright had brought his A-team for the final play. The lead figure hand-signaled to the others, and they spread out in a textbook assault formation. Jake had to admire their discipline even as he prepared to kill them. His earpiece remained silent. Maria and Daniels were holding fire, waiting for his signal. A spotlight suddenly blazed from the ridge, flooding the compound with harsh white light. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, preserving his night vision, and rolled behind better cover as automatic weapons fire raked the area where he'd been hiding. "So much for the element of surprise," he muttered, returning fire at the muzzle flashes, advancing across the yard. The battle erupted in earnest. Maria's rifle boomed from the barn roof, and Jake saw one of the assault teams spin and drop. The others dove for cover, their precise formation breaking apart under fire. But more spotlights were coming alive on the ridge, and Jake realized with cold certainty that they were badly outnumbered. The 3 of them might be good, but they weren't miracle workers. His earpiece crackled with Maria's voice, tight with strain. "Jake, we've got problems. I count at least 12 more coming down the slope." Sheriff Daniels chimed in from the cellar. "Trucks moving up the road too. They're surrounding us." Jake's mind raced, calculating angles and distances. The careful defensive positions they'd prepared were about to become a death trap. Time for improvisation. "Change of plans," he said, sprinting toward the barn while bullets whined past his head. "We're going mobile. Maria, get off that roof now." He reached the barn just as Maria rappelled down from the loft, using a rope they'd positioned earlier. Her face was grim but determined. "The main force is almost in position, maybe 2 minutes before they can coordinate." "Then we move in 1, Jake replied, grabbing the duffel bag they'd prepared for this contingency. Inside were explosives, extra ammunition, and the original documents that had started this whole nightmare. Daniels emerged from the cellar, breathing hard. "My truck's still behind the barn. If we can reach it." A massive explosion cut him off, and Jake felt the ground shake. Looking back, he saw flames rising from the house. They'd hit it with some kind of rocket launcher. "No more time," Jake said. "We go now, or we don't go at all." They ran for Daniel's pickup, keeping the barn between them and the advancing assault team. Behind them, more explosions lit up the night as Cartwright's people systematically destroyed the compound. Jake felt a stab of grief watching his grandfather's legacy burn, but he pushed it down. The old man would have understood. Sometimes you had to lose the battle to win the war. They reached the truck just as searchlights found them. Daniels gunned the engine while Jake and Maria provided covering fire from the bed. The pickup lurched forward, crashing through the fence and heading for the back country. Bullets starred the rear window as they bounced across the rough ground, but the truck held together. Jake looked back at the burning compound, his jaw set with cold determination. Cartwright thought he'd won by destroying the ranch, but he'd made a crucial mistake. Jake wasn't the scared city boy who'd arrived here weeks ago. He was something much more dangerous now, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Jake like a shroud as he crouched behind the weathered fence post, his grandfather's Winchester heavy in his hands. The cold metal reminded him of countless mornings when the old man had taught him to shoot, back when Jake thought the biggest threat on the ranch was a rattlesnake or coyote. How naive he'd been. Sheriff Dalton's cruiser sat empty near the main gate, driver's door hanging open like a broken jaw. No sign of movement from the house, but Jake knew better than to trust the silence. He'd learned that lesson the hard way over the past weeks. Silence on this ranch usually meant someone was preparing to kill you. The barn loomed in the distance, its shadow darker than the surrounding night. Inside lay the evidence that had cost so many lives. His grandfather's detailed records of the money laundering operation, names, dates, amounts that would bring down half the county's power structure. Jake had memorized every crucial detail before hiding the ledgers in a place even his grandfather hadn't thought of, the false bottom of the old well house. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Jake's finger found the trigger as his eyes swept the darkness. Movement by the corral caught his attention. A figure in a hat too small to be Dalton. Marcus Webb, probably, or one of his other hired guns. Jake had counted at least 3 vehicles on his approach, which meant the odds were stacked against him as usual. The plan was simple enough in theory: retrieve the evidence, get to the highway, and pray the state police would listen before Webb's people could silence him permanently. In practice, it meant crossing 200 yards of open ground while men with superior firepower hunted him in the dark. Jake thought of Sarah, safely hidden in the motel 2 towns over, and felt a surge of determination. She'd wanted to stay and fight, but he couldn't risk losing her too. Too many good people had died already. His grandfather, Deputy Rodriguez, even old Pete at the hardware store who'd seen too much. The weight of their deaths pressed down on him harder than the humid Texas air. The eastern horizon showed the first hint of gray. Dawn would expose him completely, eliminate any advantage the darkness might provide. Time to move. He sprinted toward the well house, keeping low and using the scattered equipment as cover. Halfway there, a rifle cracked from the direction of the barn, the bullet singing past his ear close enough to feel its heat. Jake dove behind an old plow, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Jake Morrison," Webb's voice carried across the yard, amplified by a megaphone. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, son. Let's talk this through like civilized men." Jake almost laughed. Civilized men didn't murder old ranchers in their sleep or frame innocent people for their crimes. He chambered around and called back, "Like you talked things through with my grandfather? Your grandfather was a stubborn fool who forgot his place. Don't make the same mistake." Another muzzle flash lit up the darkness, this one from the house. The bullet splintered wood inches from Jake's head, showering him with splinters. They had him in a crossfire now. The smart play Webb had probably learned in whatever military unit had trained him to kill without conscience. Jake spotted a shadow moving near the chicken coop. Sheriff Dalton, his pot-belly unmistakable even in silhouette. The man who'd sworn to protect and serve was hunting him like an animal. The betrayal still stung, even though Jake had suspected Dalton's involvement for days. The well house sat 30 yards away, an eternity of open ground under the circumstances. Jake studied the terrain, looking for any advantage his grandfather might have built into the ranch's layout. The old man had been paranoid about security, with good reason as it turned out. Then Jake remembered the irrigation ditches. They ran from the well house toward the main fields, deep enough to provide cover if he could reach them. His grandfather had dug them himself during the drought of '89, wide enough to crawl through. Jake waited for the next muzzle flash to mark his hunter's positions, then bolted toward the ditch. His boots slipped on the dew-wet grass as he slid into the narrow channel, muddy water soaking through his jeans. The smell of stagnant earth and old fertilizer filled his nostrils as he began crawling toward his destination. Behind him, voices shouted coordinates and positions. Webb's men were professional enough to know their business, but they didn't know this land like Jake did. His grandfather had taught him every secret the ranch held, preparing him for dangers the old man couldn't have imagined. The well house access panel was exactly where it should be. Hidden beneath the wooden cover his grandfather had weatherproofed every spring. Jake's fingers found the catch, and the false bottom swung open to reveal the wrapped bundle of ledgers and photographs that would finally bring justice to everyone who died protecting them. The acrid smell of smoke drifted through the pre-dawn darkness as Jake crouched behind the water trough, his grandfather's Winchester heavy in his hands. The barn, what remained of it, cast dancing shadows across the ranch yard, its skeletal frame still glowing with dying embers. Everything he'd discovered, all the evidence of the cartel's money laundering operation, had gone up in flames 3 hours ago. But they weren't done with him yet. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the silence from somewhere near the house. "Jake, come on out, son. Let's talk this through like civilized folks." Jake's jaw tightened. Morrison had arrived 20 minutes after the explosion that leveled the barn, claiming he'd seen the fire from town. But Jake had watched through binoculars as the sheriff stood talking with 3 men in tactical gear, men who definitely weren't firefighters. "Your grandfather was a smart man," Morrison called out, his voice closer now. He knew when to keep his mouth shut. "Shame you didn't inherit that particular trait." A twig snapped to Jake's left. He swung the rifle toward the sound, finger hovering over the trigger. Through the darkness, he could make out a figure moving between the cottonwoods that lined the creek. At least 4 of them, maybe more, working their way around to flank him. His cell phone buzzed against his chest. A text from Elena. "A federal agent's en route. ETA 30 minutes. Stay alive.eu. 30 minutes. Might as well be 30 hours. Jake belly crawled toward the old windmill, using its metal framework for cover. The ranch he'd inherited 3 weeks ago felt alien in the darkness. Every familiar landmark transformed into potential death traps. But somewhere beneath his city-bred panic, muscle memory stirred. Afternoons spent playing war games in these same fields, his grandfather teaching him to read the land, to use every depression and shadow to his advantage. "You know, Jake," Morrison's voice echoed off the house's walls, "I tried to make this easy. That accident in town, the warning at the diner. Hell, I even offered to buy you out at twice what the place was worth. But you just couldn't leave well enough alone." A muzzle flash erupted from behind the smokehouse. Jake rolled left as bullets sparked off the windmill's metal struts. He came up firing, working the Winchester's lever action with steady precision. The shooter cursed and dove for cover. "Looks like the boy's got some fight in him after all," someone called out. A voice Jake didn't recognize, tinged with a slight accent. Jake sprinted toward the house, zigzagging as more shots erupted around him. A bullet shattered the porch railing just as he vaulted over it, rolling through the front door. Inside, he grabbed the box of shells from the mantel and began reloading with shaking hands. Through the living room window, he could see Morrison advancing across the yard, flanked by 2 men in dark clothing. The sheriff's badge caught the moonlight, a mockery of everything it was supposed to represent. "Your grandfather and I had an understanding," Morrison shouted. "The cartel moved their money through quietly. Nobody got hurt, and this town stayed prosperous. Everybody won." Jake moved to the kitchen window, scanning the backyard. There, another figure creeping along the fence line. He raised the rifle and squeezed off a shot. The man stumbled and fell. "Except for the families destroyed by drug money," Jake called back. "Except for the kids who died from cartel product." some understanding. You think you're some kind of hero? Morrison's laugh was bitter. Boy, you're about to disappear just like that nosy reporter did last year. Another tragic accident. City slicker gets in over his head on the family ranch. The reporter. Elena had mentioned a journalist who'd been investigating the cartel connections before suddenly vanishing. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized how deep this corruption ran. How many people had died to protect the secret hidden in his barn. A sound from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps on the bedroom floor. Someone had gotten inside while he was focused on Morrison. Jake eased toward the staircase, rifle raised, every board in the old house seeming to creak under his weight. The footsteps stopped. Jake held his breath, listening. Outside, Morrison was still talking, but the words felt distant now. His world had narrowed to the darkness above, to the presence he could feel waiting in his grandfather's bedroom. A floorboard groaned behind him. Jake spun, but he was already too late. The butt of a pistol caught him across the temple, sending him crashing into the banister. The Winchester clattered away across the hardwood floor as stars exploded across his vision. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Morrison's boots on the porch steps. "Bring him outside," the sheriff ordered. "Time to finish this." Rough hands grabbed Jake under his arms, hauling him toward the door. His vision swam, but he could make out the eastern horizon starting to lighten. Dawn was coming, but he wasn't sure he'd live to see it. The game was almost over, and he was running out of moves. The first gunshot shattered the pre-dawn silence like thunder across the Texas plains. Jake rolled behind the water trough as splinters exploded from the barn wall where his head had been moments before. The metal rang like a bell as another bullet struck it, sending a spray of rusty water across his face. "Should have taken our generous offer, city boy." Marcus Kellerman's voice carried across the yard from behind his black SUV. "Now we do this the hard way." Jake pressed his back against the trough, his grandfather's Colt heavy in his hands. 3 weeks ago, he'd been debugging software in a climate-controlled office. Now he was in a gunfight over a cache of stolen cartel money that had been rotting in his barn for 20 years. The irony wasn't lost on him, even as another bullet whined overhead. Sheriff Valdez was positioned behind the old pickup truck, her service weapon trained on the tree line where muzzle flashes had been winking like deadly fireflies. "2 more coming up the east side," she called out. Jake peered around the trough's edge. Kellerman had brought 4 men, all armed with military-grade weapons that made Jake's revolver feel like a pop gun. But this was his land, his grandfather's ranch, and he knew every inch of it in ways these city criminals never could. The money had been the key to everything. Old Vicente Morales, the cartel lieutenant who'd been using the ranch as a way station, had hidden $2 million in those feed sacks before his rivals caught up with him. Jake's grandfather had found the blood-soaked barn and the hidden cash, but instead of reporting it, he'd kept quiet, too afraid of cartel retribution to move the money or spend it. For 2 decades, Samuel Hartwell had lived with that secret, watching his ranch slowly fail while a fortune gathered dust in his barn. Only when the cancer took him did he finally tell Jake the truth in that rambling letter hidden in the Bible, a final confession and a warning that someday someone would come looking. That someone was Marcus Kellerman, a dirty federal agent who'd been feeding information to the cartels for years. When new DEA investigations started getting too close to his operation, he'd remembered the old rumors about missing money at the Hartwell place. Jake's inheritance had given him the perfect opportunity to tie up loose ends. "Movement in the barn!" Valdez shouted. Jake saw him too, a figure darting between the stalls. They'd gotten inside while he was pinned down. His blood turned cold as he remembered what else was in that barn. Not just the money, but the evidence Sheriff Valdez had been gathering on Kellerman's network. If they destroyed it, good men would die and a cancer would keep spreading through law enforcement. "Cover me!" Jake broke from behind the trough, zigzagging toward the barn as bullets chewed up the dirt around his boots. He dove through the side door just as an automatic weapon opened up behind him, the door frame disintegrating in a shower of splinters. Inside the barn, dust motes danced in shafts of early morning light. Jake's breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Somewhere in the maze of stalls and hay bales, a killer was hunting him. "You're just delaying the inevitable, Hartwell." The voice came from the far end of the barn, near the ladder to the loft. "We've got your sheriff friend surrounded. Give us what we came for, and maybe she lives through this." Jake moved silently between the stalls, each step carefully placed to avoid the squeaky boards he'd learned to navigate as a child, visiting his grandfather. Amazing how those memories came flooding back when his life depended on them. He caught a glimpse of movement near the feed room, the same room where this nightmare had started. The gunman was trying to flank him, but he'd chosen the wrong approach. Jake knew about the loose board that creaked like a banshee when stepped on. The sound came right on cue, and Jake was already moving. He rounded the corner as the gunman looked down at the betraying board and fired twice. The man went down hard, his weapon clattering across the barn floor. "Tommy? Tommy, report!" Kellerman's voice crackled through a radio on the fallen man's belt. Jake grabbed the weapon and the radio. "Tommy's busy," he said into the device. "But I've got something you want, Kellerman. The money's still here, all of it. But I've got a better offer. Your life for Sheriff Valdez's." The radio was quiet for a long moment. Then Kellerman's voice came back, colder now. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, boy. This goes way beyond some old cartel money. I've got friends in very high places." "Maybe," Jake said, checking the assault rifle's magazine. "But right now, you're on my land, and I'm done running." He could hear vehicles approaching in the distance, either Kellerman's reinforcements or the backup Valdez had called for. Either way, the next few minutes would determine whether he lived to see his grandfather's legacy restored or died trying to protect it. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood as Jake pressed his back against the barn wall, his grandfather's Winchester clutched tight in his hands. Through the weathered boards, he could hear Senator Morrison's boots crunching on gravel, getting closer with each calculated step. "You can't hide forever, boy." Morrison's voice echoed across the ranch yard. "Just like your grandfather couldn't hide what he saw that night in '97. Jake's mind raced back to the yellowed photographs hidden beneath the barn's false floor, images of Morrison and 3 other men standing over a mass grave, their younger faces twisted with the cruel satisfaction of a job completed. The Comanche Creek Massacre, they'd called it in the history books, a tragic skirmish with raiders. But Grandpa Ezra had been there with his camera, documenting what really happened. The systematic execution of an entire Apache family who'd discovered Morrison's illegal mining operation on sacred land. The barn door creaked open. Jake held his breath, finger hovering over the trigger. Sunlight sliced through the darkness in a golden wedge, illuminating motes of dust that danced like ghosts in the stifling air. "I know you found the photographs," Morrison continued, his voice now inside the barn. "Ezra was always too sentimental for his own good. Should have destroyed them decades ago instead of playing this waiting game." Jake shifted his weight, and a floorboard groaned beneath him. Morrison's footsteps stopped. "There you are." The senator appeared around the corner of a hay bale, his expensive suit incongruous in the rustic setting, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the chaos of the last hour. In his manicured hands, he held a chrome-plated pistol that gleamed like a promise of death. "You killed him," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "You killed my grandfather." Morrison's lips curved into a cold smile. "Ezra died of a heart attack. The coroner's report was very clear about that. After you threatened him. After you told him you'd come for me next if he didn't hand over those photographs. Smart boy. Smarter than your grandfather gave you credit for." Morrison raised his weapon. "But not smart enough to leave well enough alone." Jake's muscles coiled like springs. He thought of everything Grandpa Ezra had taught him during those childhood summers. How to read the land, how to track wounded animals, how to shoot straight when it mattered most. The old man had been preparing him for this moment without either of them knowing it. Those families deserved justice, Jake said. Those families were in the way of progress. Texas was being built, boy. Fortunes were being made. A few casualties were inevitable. Inevitable? Jake's anger flared. You murdered children. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. And I'll murder you too, if that's what it takes to protect my legacy. The gunshot exploded through the barn with deafening force. Jake dove sideways, rolling behind a feed trough as wood splinters showered down around him. His grandfather's Winchester came up smooth and natural, like an extension of his own arms. Morrison fired again, the bullet punching through the metal trough inches from Jake's head. Water began trickling out in thin streams, creating dark puddles in the dirt. Jake rose up and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, and Morrison stumbled backward, crying out as blood bloomed across his white shirt sleeve. The senator's pistol clattered to the floor. It's over, Jake said, advancing with the rifle trained on Morrison's chest. The FBI will have those photographs within the hour. Agent Rodriguez is probably already at your campaign headquarters. Morrison clutched his wounded arm, his face pale but his eyes still burning with desperate fury. You think this ends with me? I'm just one man. The machine I built will crush you even if I'm gone. Maybe, Jake said, but at least those families will finally have their names cleared. The truth has a way of spreading, even when powerful people try to bury it. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the ranch. Morrison's gaze darted toward the barn door, then back to Jake's unwavering rifle. Your grandfather was a fool to trust you with this, Morrison spat. Jake felt a strange peace settle over him as the red and blue lights began flashing through the barn walls. No, sir. He was a wise man who knew that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. The senator sagged against a support beam as the sirens reached the ranch yard. In the distance, car doors slammed and voices shouted commands. Jake kept the Winchester steady until Agent Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, her service weapon drawn and a team of federal agents flanking her. Senator Morrison, she called out, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice. As the handcuffs clicked around Morrison's wrists, Jake finally lowered his grandfather's rifle. The deadly secret that had poisoned this land for over 2 decades was finally exposed to the cleansing light of justice.